It's great to be here with old friends and colleagues and such a distinguished panel of writers. I want to introduce at the far end Dean Takahashi. Dean's been covering business for nearly 20 years. He's the author of Opening the Xbox, among other game titles, and he's the lead writer at GamesBeat at VentureBeat. We have Matthew Handrahan. Matthew has been covering games for at least 10 years. He's currently the deputy editor for Europe at Gamesindustry.biz. And then next to me we have Sherr. He's a Silicon Valley native who writes about games and other technologies as executive editor at CNET News, and before that, the Wall Street Journal. So I promised Ian ahead of time that I would not steal any of Michelle Obama's speeches, so you might get something really original and fun. So let's get into it. What I wanted to start with is where people are getting their news these days has changed dramatically since, say, 2010. How do you guys feel about that? And I guess primarily, what do you attribute to such a shift? And we can start with you, Ian. Say anything but just millennials.
Millennials. Snapchat. So most of the interesting things I've noticed is that the importance of news publications that you would think are the ones that everyone goes to are just lessening more and more. People are going direct to the companies for news. For example, actually one of the best examples is the money that EA and Activision have put in the last couple of years toward, or in the last couple of quarters really, toward their own events they're going to hold. They pulled out of E3, they're going to hold their own events, they're going to start doing competitions. That is both a recognition about E3, but also a recognition that people like the three of us actually don't do that much in their calculation to get the news out to the people who buy their stuff. And so, as a result, they're going direct to consumers. And you've got Twitch, and you've got all these other things, YouTube. It's just become this, it's circumventing the news media. It's no longer necessary to go through us anymore. You can actually get your message out better to the people who are going to buy your game, just going to them direct. And that's pretty frightening for someone like me.
There's another quite frightening thing that's not specific to games. It's actually just across all of the internet, is the degree to which people are no longer using home pages. So much more traffic flows through social networks now, which has a kind of leveling effect in terms of the way content is received. So on Gamesindustry.biz, I mean, we don't write for consumers, we write for developers, publishers, marketers, people that work within the games industry, so we have a very specific tone, very specific focus. But the thing is, when you throw one of our articles onto Facebook, it kind of drowns because it's sandwiched between like a Clickhole piece or a BuzzFeed piece or something from The Verge or Polygon or what have you. This is an issue for us because within the context of the Gamesindustry.biz homepage, our content makes a lot of sense. On Facebook, it really doesn't. And so the pressure now, and this is a worrying thing for us, is there's a pressure on us to morph our content to fit into the context of a social network, which actually, there is this idea that the customer is always right. I mean, I think in this case, the customer is always likely to go the path of least resistance without necessarily understanding what the consequences of that are. So it does put pressure. I mean, I'd like to know what Dean thinks about this from VentureBeat's point of view, because we sort of target similar audiences.
I was going to say it really dovetails well into what Dean brought up last week about ethics and some of these ethically challenged outlets, YouTube, Twitch, and how it impacts his reviews and his coverage.
So, as journalists, we like to complain about how we have ethics, but a lot of the other popular folks out there who spread the word about things on social media don't really. And the funny thing is that, I have 3 teenage girls in my household. And, I get the newspaper. They don't read it. They read the comics. I will hear about a game and I ask them about it. And they said, oh, yeah, I heard about that yesterday. And, they're not listening to CNN, they're not reading things. So I'm going like, okay, how did you guys hear about this thing? And it's like, just from our friends. And they also don't care about that ethics part. They don't really care that they didn't hear the information from an established journalistic source. They just heard it, they passed along, their friends passed it along, and so, you know, that's kind of the way it is right now.
So do you blame EA then for having, you know, set up this direct-to-consumer experience at E3, or do you think that it's fairly relevant given the state of things?
Well, I mean, I blame might be just like an irrelevant way of looking at it. Is whether or not it's a good or a bad thing. I think. No, I think that serves a purpose from a consumer perspective, but at the same time, you can't divorce it from the fact that EA is doing that because it wants to control how its information is framed, how it is seen, and that isn't always in the consumer's best interest, but is whether or not the consumer, I mean, as Dean was saying, like, as whether the consumer actually sees that as a relevant concern or, you know, maybe even thinks about it that way at all. So in that sense, perhaps it is relevant to the consumer, but do you think about the way you get news that deeply or the way you get your information that deeply?
And just to take it from a different point of view, like when I was working at the Wall Street Journal, one of the very interesting things that happened was that Microsoft and Google stopped putting out their press releases for the quarterly results on the wires. They would put out a statement on the wires saying, and they'd send like a little thing to the SEC saying, go to our website to find out how we did. And this was like revelatory when it happened. Like the world stopped for a minute and thought, is this okay? Is this kosher? Can we trust that this is being done? And it has become standard fare now. And so what did that do? That completely broke down the value of people like Bloomberg and Reuters who made their living by the microsecond of getting that financial information to their users. So it started there. Now, fast forward a few years and here we are, games publications complaining about how the exact similar type of thing is happening, but now from the game companies, right? And part of it is, there are a couple of things, right? We have to stand on our own and not rely on those companies to be our news, right? And we have to generate our own interest and reason for people to come to us versus just rewriting press releases, which in theory is what journalism is about anyway. But on top of that, it makes it much more imperative for us to seek out the more interesting stories because people don't give a shit about the other stuff. Sorry, I shouldn't say shit. They just don't care anymore about rewriting the marketing material, right? They're going to get it no matter what. Who cares?
And you know, to add to that, it's something that we think about a lot on my website because, you know, again, we're writing for people that are probably engaged with this stuff anyway. They're probably waiting for the quarterlies to come out the same way that we are. You know, at the start of my career, we would kind of wait and at the very moment they were released, we'd get right on top of it. We'd put out like a abbreviated version of that story and add to it to make sure we were the first out. But that, I mean, it's just a completely, it just doesn't make sense to do it that way anymore.
Your best headline is like, here's the top 10 things you need to know about Intel's earnings today, right?
Yeah, or how something, something. I mean, but, you know, so now it's more how you can make use of the information that's commonly available and how you can best present it to people. So really, like now, we want to be the definitive take on an issue rather than the first take or the hot take.
Right. I was going to say years ago it was about, you know, getting your preview builds and review builds off in time and having the right sort of communications channel to reach you guys. That obviously has changed. Is there conversations at a deeper level or conversations that you guys have with PR reps on how to sort of either streamline the process or how to get you guys involved in a different way?
I mean, I find the word streamlining to be sort of curiously out of place given the just volume of products, developers, and different things you can cover. It's kind of been the opposite for me. I feel sort of completely overwhelmed by the amount of available choices, and it's how you make decisions about what you cover within that. Whereas before, 10 years ago when I was writing for a magazine and we had these strict deadlines and stuff, it was all a little bit more regimented and easier to tackle. I don't know how, I mean, particularly with Dean, you've been doing this a lot longer than I have.
So are we getting to how we like to be pitched? Is that sort of more the question?
Sort of, yeah. I mean, everybody has their preferences, but I was just wondering if there's, you know, a discussion about how they can, you know, how it could be easier for you. I guess we could talk more about how you like to be pitched because I know that there's specific stories that you're interested in at different times.
I've tried to make things easier. I did publish a story on how to do game PR back in February of 2015. So that's still on the internet and still.
Does it have Snapchat mentioned in it?
No, it doesn't have
Okay.
that. But you know,
for an update.
there's some basic rules, some basic hierarchies also that you should be aware of. Like, you know, go to CNN first and see what they say, you know, about your story. Go to the Wall Street Journal next. Go to CNET. Eventually, you get to me and say, you know, nobody else wanted to publish my story, but here's my pitch for you. So that there's like that hierarchy, and there's also this hierarchy that I go through of, you know, like I might be able to do 5 stories today, and it's got to be one of the best ones. And if it's not, then I'm just going to pass on it, and the opportunity is going to pass by. And so then, you know, we start, you know, deciding, you know, which pitch has sort of come in the best, which is the hottest that we have to do now. And you know, a lot of the times I say that, you know, the pitches that come in from PR people actually are better than the ones that come in directly from somebody who's making a game. So, you know, that's just something to be aware of. And, you know, we'll take more pitches and more stories, I think, from people where we have a real ongoing relationship.
How much of a jump do you generally appreciate if someone has some news? I mean, is it a week? Is it less than a week? Does it need to be a certain number of days if it's solid news, if it's a good opportunity for you?
I mean, it depends on what it is, really. As we were discussing before, there's actually very little now, I think, where you really have to be kind of ready to go at the moment that the news is, you know, with the embargo lifts or whatever. There are some stories that are, but, you know, that there's a lot of news that we're asked to accept under embargo where the embargo is not so much necessary. I mean, really it's about the kind of access that we're given or the way that it's framed, you know.
Yeah,
Brought up the E word, so you got to explain it.
Huh?
He brought up the E word, so he has to explain it.
Embargoed. That thing that tries to make it seem important, yes. Yeah. So
You can look at it like that.
I do look at it that way. So for us, like, because we're the world's largest tech news site, we feel this kind of very, we have this role that we need to separate the wheat from the chaff, right? And so for us, a lot of it is trying to see, okay, what are the industry trends, what's going on? Every once in a while, there's going to be an individual announcement that we care about, like Battlefield 1, where I'll be like, okay, I was there, I watched the video, my eardrums were blown out, and I wrote about it, right? But I didn't even write about it just as Battlefield 1. If you look up the story, it's more about, you know, look, this is where it's going, this is what they're trying to do. Right, I'm trying to offer more analysis than just rewriting the press release. Right. And so introducing a human intelligence element to it takes time, and so we're very thoughtful about the ones we choose. When it's not a Fortune 500 company, generally then I'm looking, okay, how do you fit into the larger themes I'm looking at, right? Stuff like, how are indies starting to find their way in the industry or something like that? Like, there are always some sort of a theme I'm trying to think about, and sometimes they fit in. But otherwise, I mean, you look at CNET, look at the games coverage, most of it is either, you know, we partner with GameSpot because we're under the same umbrella. It's either partnership stuff with them, little announcements that maybe the hardcore people care about, or it's these larger trend stories. And that's what I spend all my time on.
Yeah. I mean, fundamentally, it is a bit of a crapshoot. There really isn't a way that I can think of where I could say, if you pitch like this, then you're dramatically more likely to get coverage. I mean, oddly, and this might just be the website that I write for, because again, we do have this different focus. The 2 most popular stories I've ever published in my career as a journalist, neither developer exists anymore. One of them only released 1 game, and it didn't even come out on any distribution platform. It was the fact that, so basically I think the point is that the kind of game that is popular commercially is not the same thing as the kind of game that is popular among readers of websites. So that is something to bear in mind. I would much rather, so a game like Papers, Please, or Cart Life, or The Revolution 1979, I mean, look these games up there, or this War of Mine, the 11-bit Studios game. I mean, these don't sell more than 50,000 copies, but they generate an awful lot of, you know, virtual column inches, or whatever you want to call it, far more so than something that might get 30, 50, 60 million downloads.
Great.
Except Pokemon Go, that breaks every rule.
Yes.
Breaks every rule everywhere.
Breaks every rule everywhere, ever.
What about what not to do? We also talked on the phone about some very interesting stories that you all had. I think Matthew, in your case, it was folks calling you and asking you to write reviews when you actually don't write reviews.
To write reviews and previews, I get maybe a dozen emails a day offering review code. My website's existed for 14 years and we've never ever published a review. These are really elementary mistakes, and they're born of an approach where the PR strategy is just to hit everybody with exactly the same email. The issue is, I mean, like us, we have to wade through all of the content to find what we're interested in. I mean, I think now it really demands the same approach the other way. Pick the sort of websites you want to work with and make sure you're talking to them the way they demand to be talked to. I would also say avoid gimmicks. I mean, don't spend money on buying kind of tchotchkes and T-shirts and things like that, because really they just go straight to the Goodwill store. They don't really get you anywhere with a journalist.
I always thought it didn't take too much time to do research and really explore and dig into what you guys are writing about to ultimately ascertain what you care about and what will be engaging. Dean, is there something that you've come across that?
So I would say I don't get enough of those pitches where you really care about some kind of human element. It's sort of like the Olympics where before an event they're put on a profile of an athlete, the star athlete of the event or something, and they take you back to their hometown and they tell you where they grew up and how much they had to overcome in order to get to the Olympics, and that's really more compelling stuff as to why you're interested in this particular athlete or this particular race or something. And we don't get a lot of those kinds of pitches as well. We're getting more dry material about the details of a game, or just when it's going to be published or something like that, and we're not learning about some of the more human element behind it. And like one example was that this one woman who was showing me a game and pitching it to me, she said, "Yeah, my mother's a game designer," and I had to think about that and say, okay, what are the odds of that happening? There's 20% of the people in the industry are women. A couple of decades plus ago, this woman's mother was a game developer as well. Awesome. That's pretty rare. And so just immediately I jumped on that and said, hey, I know you're pitching your game here, but your mother and you, that's the story.
I mean, there's kind of a disconnect, I think, in the way the press sees journalists see themselves and the way the industry sees journalists. I mean, we are kind of viewed by a lot of developers as just a way of selling games effectively, and that really
free marketing.
Yeah, free marketing, and that really is the opposite of what we're supposed to be doing. As Dean suggests, we want to tell stories. We want to find that, and if in your subject line the first thing I see is retro style puzzle platformer, I'm probably not going to open the email, because I'll see that subject line 10 times a day. I mean, that's the thing. It takes a lot of effort to make a game, and therefore every game can seem unique or interesting to the people making it. But from our perspective, when you are hit with this flood day after day after day, we have to find ways in. And Dean's example there is a really good one.
And I respect the situation where a lot of people in this room are like, did you pitch Dean yet? Did you pitch Ian yet? Did you pitch him? How about now? And it's really hard to get past that, to be able to actually, because sometimes you're just, you can't polish a turd, right? So it's a hard job, I get that. I think the interesting thing from my point of view, as I look at the rest of the publishing industry, and I see all traffic going down, I see them all struggling to get attention, and I see stuff like Facebook social, but also stuff like Twitch and YouTube getting attention taken away from a lot of those publishers. And so they're under the gun to deal with that, right? And it's this very odd situation going on. I don't know what the solution is. It may be that we're going to see some publications start to fold or start to come together. I don't know. But there are these other issues going on as well that are pushing publications to go in one direction or another to figure out, okay, how do we get that attention back? And the answer is not, let's republish the press release, right? Because that's already happening over here. We can't do that anymore, right?
So some of this is a little borderline corny here, but our approach is like, let's set up a game community, right? And so, we let people know that we focus just on games, and that, the bigger publications may cover your story, but, we're going to cover the whole sort of life cycle of your company. And so we can sort of say that we're going to pay attention a lot more of the time than the other publications will. We also set up our conferences, our GamesBeat conferences, where we, invite all kinds of speakers, but we do invite developers to come and, pitch us as well, or to somehow get involved. So we have this ability to form relationships with the people. And when we're talking and regularly meeting like that, then eventually we get to covering the right stories in a much better way. And so, like I said, we take this community approach that combines writing about people, but also having events.
Dean, have you seen some real gold nuggets and some interesting story opportunities coming out of your conferences?
Yeah, I mean, for one, we cover most of the people who are speaking there. In fact, we covered word for word everything that Ian said as he was moderating one of the panels at our GamesBeat Summit
Not because I'm
conference.
special.
So that's almost automatic. But yeah, just meeting people, some of the people who have won contests in the past for us, becomes very easy and good subjects for profiles. They go on and get funding. It was, like one of our happy moments was when one of the VCs at Accel met the guy from Angry Bird, or from Rovio, and they wound up funding them to the tune of $40 million. And so they were the first big investor in Rovio, the maker of Angry Birds. So things like that happen at our conferences, and we're happy when it does.
Awesome. I wanted to talk a little bit about trends before we open it up to Q&A, because we will have at least 5 minutes of Q&A towards the end of the session. We talked for a second about Pokemon. One of the things that Dean mentioned recently was a session that you heard Neil Young give yesterday about adoption curve of new technologies. I guess it was specific to AR, and you walked away with some interesting things to say about that. What was the most interesting thing that you captured from that session?
I think he was sort of right on the nose about just explaining why it was much easier for this particular game to take off compared to things like virtual reality, where you have to adopt a couple $1,000 worth of hardware on a PC, or buy something. Whereas with Pokemon Go, all you had to do was look down at your phone, download the app, start walking around, and that was it. You didn't even have to pay for it. So that, combined with the Pokemon IP that had so much pent-up demand, was a great formula for easy adoption by the mass market.
It seems to mirror the initial or the evolved adoption of casual and indie games through phones and tablets versus consoles.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that Pokemon's a kind of like an unrepeatable trick in a way. I don't think it's AR that did it. I think it's certainly more the Pokemon IP, and I also think there's a kind of mimetic quality to the way it's experienced in the world. I mean, the story of Pokemon Go isn't the game, because if you look at the reviews, it's really not getting very good reviews at all. It's the stories of people being out in the world and doing it, and seeing people out in the world and doing it. I think it's that and the IP, and actually AR is really not a part of that.
Sure. It's more of a social phenomenon. Your opinion on Pokemon and AR?
I mean, I think it's really fascinating that a arguably mediocrely reviewed game can get that much attention. And I think a lot of it also is that, we're in the summer doldrums, and we just had a really shitty couple weeks as a country, and this is a nice little distraction to make us kind of forget a lot of the tough stuff we're going through. And I mean, the same weekend like 2 days after the Dallas shooting is when this game goes bananas. I feel like there can't be a coincidence there.
Dean, Matt, Ian, thank you guys so much. Please write about my Match 3 puzzler when it comes out. Bret, thank you for hosting an amazing panel. Everybody, let's give it up for our panel.